There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Ancient tombs hold more than just the dead. They hold curses waiting to be awakened. Tonight, a young man will witness a dangerous ritual to contact an Egyptian queen, only to discover the horrifying power contained in a single, cursed jewel. London, even in the dead of night, is never truly silent. There is always the distant rumble of a carriage, the mournful cry of a ship's horn from the Thames, the low, ever-present hum of a sleeping metropolis. For Malcolm Ross, a young barrister with a mind more inclined toward logic than legend, these were the familiar, comforting sounds of his world. But on this particular night, the peace of his respectable bachelor lodgings was about to be shattered by a summons from a world far older and stranger than his own. He was woken from a deep sleep by a frantic, insistent knocking at his front door. Not the polite rap of a late-night visitor, but the urgent, desperate drumming of a fist that spoke of panic. Groggy and irritated, he pulled on a dressing gown and made his way to the door, expecting to find a messenger with a late telegram or a neighbor in some sort of trouble. When he pulled the door open, he was met not with a stranger, but with a face he knew well, a face that made his heart beat a little faster for reasons both pleasant and, on this night, deeply alarming. It was Margaret Trelawney. She was the daughter of the great Egyptologist, Abel Trelawney, a man whose name was synonymous with daring desert expeditions and controversial theories about the ancient world. Malcolm had met Margaret at several society gatherings and had been captivated by her intelligence and her strange, otherworldly beauty. But the woman who stood before him now was not the calm, composed heiress he knew. Her face was pale as ivory in the gaslight, her large, dark eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have consumed her. She was breathless, her fine cloak thrown hastily over a simple evening dress, and she clutched a small, leather-bound book to her chest as if it were a shield. "Malcolm, thank God you are here," she gasped, her voice a strained whisper. "You must come, at once. It's my father. It's tonight." The words made little sense, but the sheer force of her terror was infectious. "Miss Trelawney, Margaret, what is it? What's happened?" "There's no time to explain," she said, her gaze darting up and down the empty street as if she expected to be followed. "He is going through with it. The great experiment, just as he planned. He's locked himself in the study with her. Please, you are the only one I can trust. The only one who might understand." Malcolm's mind raced. He knew, as did all of London, of Abel Trelawney's eccentricities. The man was a genius, but his obsessions ran deep. The great experiment was a phrase Malcolm had heard whispered in connection with Trelawney's most prized and controversial discovery. The perfectly preserved mummy of Queen Tara, a mysterious sorceress queen from an obscure dynasty, whose tomb Trelawney had found and, against all academic and ethical advice, brought back to London. And she could only mean the mummy itself. A cold dread began to seep into Malcolm's bones, a feeling utterly alien to his rational, well-ordered life. This was not a matter of legal precedent or logical deduction. This was something else entirely. But the look in Margaret's eyes, a desperate plea for help, overrode all of his reservations. "Of course," he said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "Let me get my coat." The Trelawney house was a grand but imposing structure in a respectable London square. But as their hansom cab pulled up before it, Malcolm felt as if he were arriving not at a gentleman's residence, but at the entrance to a tomb. The house was dark, save for a single, ominous light burning in the window of the ground-floor study Abel Trelawney's private sanctum. The air around the house felt unnaturally still and heavy, as if the normal, bustling life of the city simply ceased to exist at its doorstep. Margaret led him inside using her own key. The moment they stepped across the threshold, the familiar sounds of London vanished, replaced by a profound, oppressive silence. The air within the house was thick and cloying, heavy with a scent he couldn't quite place, a strange, sweet, and dusty smell like exotic spices and ancient, dried flowers. The great hall was not decorated with the typical trappings of a wealthy London home. Instead, it was a museum of the dead. Shadowy, man-sized statues of Anubis and Horus stood like silent sentinels in the corners, their animal heads and dark, stone eyes seeming to follow their every move. Glass cases contained rows of funerary urns, intricate amulets, and fragments of papyrus covered in cryptic hieroglyphs. It was a house that was not lived in, but haunted by the displaced spirits of a long-dead civilization. Malcolm felt like an intruder, a man of the modern world trespassing in a place that belonged to the past. Margaret led him not towards the study, but to a small drawing room opposite. Her hands were trembling. "My father gave me strict instructions," she said, her voice low and tense. "He and we are to be the participants. We will be in the study with the mummy." He believes that tonight, at the exact celestial alignment, he can use the rituals from an ancient manuscript to make contact. She swallowed hard. To reawaken the spirit of Queen Tara. The words were madness. Utter, unadulterated madness. And yet, Margaret spoke them with the grim conviction of a believer. He says it is the culmination of his life's work. He believes Queen Tara achieved a form of immortality, that her soul is not dead, but merely sleeping, waiting to be called back. And you believe this? Malcolm asked, his voice betraying his skepticism. I believe my father is a genius who has delved into knowledge that other men fear, she replied, her gaze unwavering. And that is what terrifies me. He is not playing a game. He is deadly serious. Which is why I need you. She finally extended the leather-bound book she had been clutching. It was her father's private journal. He gave me this with instructions for you. He knows this experiment is dangerous. He calls you his safeguard. You are to be the link to the outside world, the anchor to reality. Your role is to wait. To wait. You are to stand outside the study door. Listen. If you hear anything that sounds like a struggle, a cry for help, anything that signals the experiment has gone horribly wrong, you are to break down the door. You are to stop it, by any means necessary. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. He made me promise to bring you here. He trusts your courage and your clear head. He knows you do not believe, and that is why he chose you. You will not be susceptible to the influences within the room. The weight of the responsibility settled on Malcolm like a physical shroud. He was to be a sentry, a lonely guard standing watch over a ritual of black magic, tasked with intervening if a man's obsession finally tipped over into life-threatening insanity. It was a grotesque and terrifying duty. He was being asked to stand on the precipice of a madman's abyss and be ready to pull him back. He took the journal, its old leather cool and smooth beneath his fingers. He had no choice. He had been summoned, not just by Margaret's fear, but by the strange, magnetic pull of the house itself. The silence, the scent of the tomb, the watchful eyes of the stone godsit was all part of a ceremony that had begun long before he arrived. He was a reluctant actor, thrust onto a dark stage in the final act of a play whose script was written in the language of the dead. He followed Margaret out of the drawing room and took up his post, a lone guardian standing before a closed door, behind which a man was preparing to awaken a queen who had been sleeping for 4,000 years. Malcolm stood alone in the oppressive silence of the hallway, a solitary guardian posted outside the closed study door. The weight of his promise to Margaret felt like a physical pressure on his shoulders. He was a man of law, of facts and evidence, yet he had been tasked with watching over a scene straight out of a madman's fever dream. The silence from within the study was, for a time, absolute. It was a dead, breathless quiet, more unnerving than any sound would have been. He could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat counting down to an unknown, dreadful event. His instructions were to wait, to listen, but a gnawing curiosity, mixed with a very real fear for Margaret's safety, began to eat at him. The door was of heavy, dark oak, but at its center, at eye level, was a small, sliding panel, a feature sometimes found in old houses for servants to check on a room without entering. It was a long shot, but perhaps it wasn't locked. With trembling fingers, he reached out and pushed against the small brass handle. To his surprise, it slid sideways with a soft, well-oiled whisper, opening a narrow slit that allowed him to peer directly into the chamber of the experiment. The first thing that assailed him was the smell. It rushed out of the small opening in a thick, almost visible wave, a scent so ancient and complex it seemed to tell a story all its own. It was a potent, cloying perfume that spoke of the desert and the tomb. At its heart was the sweet, heady aroma of burning incense, not the familiar scent of an English church, but something far more exotic and narcotic, like sandalwood, myrrh, and lotus blossoms all burning at once. Woven through the sweetness was a drier, more sinister scent. The unmistakable 1,000-year-old dust of an open sarcophagus, the dry, mineral smell of linen that has turned to powder, of desiccated flesh, and of time itself. It was the scent of a sealed chamber finally breathing its dead air into his world, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As his eyes adjusted, he began to take in the scene within. The room was not a study anymore. It had been transformed. All of Abel Trelawney's familiar furniture, his desk, his comfortable reading chairs, his shelves of academic books, had been pushed back against the walls and draped in dark cloths, making them look like a congregation of hunched, mourning figures. The center of the room had been cleared, creating a ritual space, a stage for the terrible drama about to unfold. The room was not lit by gaslight or candles. The only illumination came from 7 strange, ornate lamps, arranged in a wide circle on the floor. Each lamp was of a different design, wrought from different metals: gold, silver, bronze, iron, and each burned with a different colored flame. One flame was a deep, sapphire blue. Another, a vibrant, emerald green. A third, a blood-red crimson. These 7 points of unnatural light cast long, dancing shadows that writhed on the walls and painted the faces of the room's occupants in a ghastly, shifting panoply of colors. It was like looking into a scene from a stained-glass window depicting a scene from hell. Within this circle of eerie light stood Abel Trelawney and his daughter, Margaret. Trelawney was no longer the eccentric academic Malcolm knew. He was a high priest, dressed in a simple white robe, his face a mask of intense, almost fanatical concentration. Margaret stood opposite him, holding a fragile, unrolled papyrus scroll, her face pale and strained in the shifting, colored light. But they were not what held Malcolm's gaze. It was the room itself, the treasury of tombs that Trelawney had assembled. The space was a shrine to the Egyptian cult of the dead. Against one wall was a row of 4 large canopic jars, their lids carved into the heads of the 4 sons of Horus Hawk, the baboon, the jackal, and the man, their stone eyes staring blankly into the room, eternal guardians of sacred organs. The walls themselves were covered not with wallpaper, but with large, painted reproductions of hieroglyphic panels, depicting scenes of judgment, of gods weighing a human heart against a feather. Statues of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of knowledge, and Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the underworld, stood in the corners, their presence lending the room the solemn, terrifying atmosphere of a genuine burial chamber. It felt profoundly wrong. A sacred space torn from the heart of the desert and reassembled in a London drawing room. A sacrilege of the highest order. And then his eyes fell upon the centerpiece of this unholy collection. Dominating the far side of the ritual circle, positioned like an altar, was the sarcophagus. It was a massive, imposing monolith of red granite, its surface covered with intricate carvings of gods and goddesses, its hieroglyphs telling the life story of the queen who lay within. It was not open, but its lid was slightly ajar, propped up just enough to create a dark, shadowed slit. It radiated an aura of immense age and a deep, profound coldness that seemed to suck the warmth from the very air. This was the focal point. This was the throne of the silent queen, the vessel that held the physical remains of the spirit they were attempting to call forth. Malcolm felt a primal fear looking at it, the instinctive terror of a living creature in the presence of a powerful, sleeping predator. He could almost feel the weight of the 40 centuries of silence that emanated from the cold stone. Finally, his gaze was drawn to the object for which the experiment was named. On a small, black pedestal near the head of the sarcophagus, placed with the reverence of a holy relic, rested the artifact itself, the jewel of 7 stars. It was a bangle, an armlet of exquisite and terrifying beauty. It was crafted from a pale, lustrous gold, fashioned into the form of 7 stylized serpents, their bodies coiling together to form the band. Each serpent's head was reared up, its mouth open, and held within its fangs was a gemstone. 6 of the gems corresponded to the colored flames of the lamps: a sapphire, an emerald, a topaz, a diamond, an amethyst, and a turquoise. They glittered and shone in the strange light, catching the colors and refracting them in a dazzling, hypnotic display. But it was the 7th serpent, the largest one at the center of the bangle, that captured all of his attention. This serpent held not a colored gem, but a ruby of astonishing size and depth, the color of fresh, arterial blood. And it was not inert. Unlike the other gems, this one did not merely reflect the light. It seemed to possess a light of its own. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic, inner glow, a soft, crimson beat like a sleeping heart. It was a slow, steady, patient pulse, as if it had been beating this way for millennia, waiting in the darkness of the tomb for this very moment. This was the key, the conduit, the anchor that would, if Trelawney's theories were correct, draw the soul of Queen Tara back across the abyss of death. Looking at its baleful, rhythmic glow, Malcolm felt a new kind of fear. It was not just an object. It was alive. Or rather, it was a vessel for a life, a prison for a fragment of a soul. The oppressive atmosphere of the room, the strange lights, the silent sarcophagus, it all emanated from this single, beautiful, and utterly cursed object. It was the heart of the ritual, the heart of the house, and perhaps the still-beating heart of the mummy herself. And as Malcolm watched, its slow, crimson pulse seemed to be growing just a little stronger, a little faster, as if it could sense the incantations were about to begin. Through the narrow slit in the door, Malcolm Ross watched as the moment he had been dreading arrived. A profound and deliberate shift occurred within the room. A clear signal that the preliminary preparations were over and the true ritual was about to commence. Abel Trelawney, standing like a statue in his white robes, gave a single solemn nod to his daughter. It was time. The great experiment had begun. Margaret, her face a pale oval in the eerie, multicolored light, moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the grim, tomb-like atmosphere. She went to each of the house's normal gas lamps, which had been burning low, and one by one, she extinguished them. With each hiss of extinguished gas, a corner of the room was surrendered to a deeper, more profound darkness. Soon, the only illumination came from the 7 strange, mystical lamps arranged in their circle on the floor. The effect was instantaneous and deeply unsettling. The room was no longer a London study playing host to ancient artifacts. It was now entirely their domain. The shadows cast by the 7 colored flames grew long and sharp, stretching and writhing across the floor and walls like living things. The familiar outlines of the draped furniture were lost, and the room became a cavern of shifting, unnatural color and deep, abyssal blackness. The faces of the Egyptian gods carved on the walls and jars seemed to animate in the flickering light, their expressions appearing to shift from stoic indifference to knowing, sinister leers. The world of logic and reason, the world of 19th century London, had been officially banished from this space. Now only magic dark and ancient remained. A new, deeper silence fell. It was a silence filled with a humming, electric tension. Abel Trelawney closed his eyes, his hands held open at his sides, his body utterly still as if making himself a receptive vessel for whatever was to come. He was no longer a scholar. He was an antenna, reaching out into the abyss. Then he gave a second, almost imperceptible nod. This was Margaret's cue to begin. With hands that trembled only slightly, Margaret raised the fragile papyrus scroll. It was so old, so delicate, that Malcolm feared it might disintegrate into dust before she could read from it. In the strange light, he could see the columns of intricate, spidery hieratic script, a language that had not been spoken aloud by a living tongue for thousands of years. She drew a deep, shuddering breath, and then she began to read. The sound that issued from her lips was one of the most unnerving things Malcolm had ever heard. It was not a language in any sense that he understood. There were no familiar vowels, no recognizable consonants. It was a series of low, guttural and sibilant sounds, a rhythmic and hypnotic chant that was more akin to a snake's hiss or a leopard's growl than to human speech. The words were ancient, imbued with the dust of dead empires and the power of forgotten gods. Her voice, usually so clear and melodic, was transformed. It was low, monotonous and resonant, as if she were not speaking the words herself but was merely a channel for a voice far older and more powerful than her own. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for millennia. As she chanted, the very atmosphere in the room began to change. It became thick, heavy, and difficult to breathe, as if the air itself were acquiring mass and weight. Malcolm felt a strange pressure building in his ears, the kind one feels before a violent thunderstorm. The smoke from the 7 incense burners, which had been rising in lazy, gentle plumes, now began to behave unnaturally. It ceased to rise. Instead, it coiled and writhed in the air at waist height, forming thick, ghostly serpents of gray and white that twisted and slithered between the 7 colored lamps, weaving a mystical, vaporous cage in the center of the room. The temperature plummeted. Malcolm, standing in the relative warmth of the hallway, felt a wave of intense, grave-like cold wash over him from the small opening in the door. It was a damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the London night. It was the cold of the sealed tomb, the cold of a place that had never known the sun, and it made him shiver uncontrollably. This was not a product of his imagination. He was witnessing a physical manifestation, a true alteration of the environment based on the power of the words Margaret was speaking. Trelawney's insane theories were proving to be terrifyingly real. And then he saw the first definitive sign of a response, the first clear proof that their call into the void was being answered. His eyes were drawn, as if by a magnet, to the jewel of 7 stars. The ruby at the center of the cursed bangle, which had been pulsing with a slow, faint, sleepy rhythm, began to change. As Margaret's chanting grew louder, more insistent, the ruby's light intensified. Its soft, crimson glow brightened to a deep, angry red, and its pulse quickened. It was no longer a sleeping heart. It was an awakening one. Thump thump, thump thump. It beat with a steady, deliberate rhythm, a perfect, horrifying synchronization with the cadence of the ancient incantations. Malcolm stared, mesmerized and horrified. He was witnessing a direct cause-and-effect reaction. The ancient words were the stimulus, and the glowing heart of the jewel was the response. It was a conduit, a supernatural receiver that was picking up a signal from across the chasm of death. The connection was being forged. The curse, which had lain dormant for 4,000 years, was stirring from its long slumber. It was a living thing, and Margaret's voice was the stimulus that was waking it up. The other 6 gems on the bangle began to react as well. They started to glow with their own internal light, no longer just reflecting the flames from the lamps. The sapphire shone with a deep, cold blue, the emerald with a venomous green. The entire artifact was coming alive, a constellation of malevolent stars awakening in the tomb-like dark. The air vibrated with a low, humming sound, a subaudible drone that Malcolm felt in his teeth and bones more than he heard with his ears. It was the sound of immense power being drawn from some unseen source, focused and channeled into that single, beautiful and terrible object. Trelawney's eyes snapped open, and they were filled with a terrifying, triumphant gleam. He saw the pulsing jewel, felt the vibrating air, and a faint, mad smile touched his lips. It was working. His life's work, his derided theories, his sacrilegious obsession, it was all being validated in this single, horrifying moment. He raised his own arms, his palms facing the sarcophagus, and began a low chant of his own, his voice weaving a deeper, more commanding harmony with his daughter's. The pressure in the room became almost unbearable. Malcolm felt a sense of immense, ancient intelligence focusing its attention on the chamber. It was a vast, cold, and utterly alien consciousness, like the mind of a spider or a shark, ancient and merciless. It was the awareness of Queen Terra, her sleeping soul stirred from its eternal rest by the insistent call of her jewel and the sound of her own secret, magical language. The ruby's pulse grew faster and faster, its light more and more brilliant, until it was a frantic, strobing beat of crimson light. The ritual was reaching its peak. The door was being unlocked. The veil between worlds was growing terrifyingly thin. Malcolm wanted to scream, to smash the door down as he had promised, to end this madness before it was too late. But he was frozen, a helpless spectator at a supernatural birth, unable to look away from the terrible miracle unfolding before him. The awakening was almost complete. The Queen was about to answer their call. The ritual had reached its terrifying apex. The air in the room was no longer just heavy. It was a physical entity, a crushing weight that seemed determined to press the life from everything within it. The low, humming vibration that Malcolm felt in his bones had risen in pitch to a sharp, keening note that scraped at the edges of his hearing, a sound like grinding stone or tearing silk. The frantic, strobing beat of the ruby at the heart of the bangle was now so fast and so bright that it was painful to look at, a crimson heartbeat gone wild, on the verge of a terrible cardiac arrest. This was the final, desperate moments before the barrier between worlds, strained to its absolute limit, finally snapped. And then it happened. With a suddenness that defied all expectation, the pulsing ruby did not just grow brighter. It erupted. A silent, concussive wave of pure, emerald green light burst forth from the bangle. It was not the soft, venomous green of the emerald gem beside it, but a blinding, ferocious, and utterly otherworldly color, a shade of green that had no name in the mortal world. It was the color of ancient magic, of spectral fire, of the soul of a sorceress given visible form. The light flooded the room in an instant, a tidal wave of spectral energy. It was so intense, so absolute, that it completely overpowered the colored flames of the 7 lamps, washing them out until they were nothing but pale, insignificant flickers. The shifting, colored shadows were annihilated, replaced by a single, uniform, and terrifyingly brilliant green glow that illuminated every corner of the room with a merciless, clinical clarity. In that moment of blinding revelation, Malcolm saw every detail with a horrifying precision. The terrified, ecstatic face of Abel Trelawney, the sheer, wide-eyed horror on Margaret's face as she stopped her chanting, and the intricate, emotionless faces of the stone gods watching from the walls. But his gaze was torn from the living and drawn to the dead. The source of the eruption, the blazing relic on its pedestal, was now the undeniable center of the universe. It shone with a power that felt both creative and destructive, a raw, untamed magic that hummed with a palpable and dangerous life. The bangle was no longer a key. It was a gateway that had been flung wide open, and something was coming through. From the dark, narrow slit of the slightly ajar sarcophagus, a thin, black wisp of what looked like smoke began to seep out. It was not smoke. It was darker than any smoke, a sliver of pure, concentrated night unfurling into the brilliant green light. It did not dissipate. Instead, it grew, more and more of the dark substance pouring out from the stone tomb, coiling in the air before it like a serpent of shadow. It gathered and swirled, a chaotic, churning vortex of darkness that seemed to be pulling itself together, taking on a form. Slowly, agonizingly, the swirling mist began to coalesce. It rose from the sarcophagus, drawing itself upward into a tall, vaguely humanoid shape. It was hazy, indistinct, its edges blurred and constantly shifting, as if it were a heat shimmer on a desert road or a figure seen through troubled water. Yet, despite its ephemeral nature, It possessed an undeniable presence, an aura of immense authority and ancient, regal power. Malcolm watched, his lungs burning for air he couldn't draw, as the phantom of Queen Tara, the sorceress who had slept for 4 millennia, took form in the heart of a London drawing room. She, for the shape was unmistakably that of a tall, proud woman, was cloaked in the swirling, dark mist of her own essence. But as she solidified, details began to emerge. He could see the faint outline of a royal headdress, the silhouette of long, dark hair, and the proud, straight line of her shoulders. She was a queen even in this ghostly, half-formed state. Her presence commanded the room, dwarfing the living occupants, who now seemed like frightened children in the face of a true and terrible divinity. The phantom remained still for a moment, as if orienting itself, a being of the ancient, silent desert suddenly thrust into a world of noise and unnatural light. Then her head turned. She did not have a face, not in any recognizable sense, only a smoother, darker patch of shadow where her features should have been. And yet, Malcolm felt her gaze sweep across the room, a cold, imperious assessment that dismissed Abel Trelawney and Margaret as utterly insignificant. Her attention, her entire being, was focused on one thing and one thing only: the blazing bangle. With a movement that was slow, deliberate, and filled with an agonizing, eternal longing, the phantom of Queen Tara began to raise her arm. A spectral hand, formed from the same swirling, dark mist, detached itself from her body. It was a long, elegant hand, with slender fingers that tapered to sharp points. It did not reach for Margaret, who had spoken the words that summoned her. It did not reach for Trelawney, the man whose obsession had torn her from her rest. It reached with a desperate, undeniable purpose, for the jewel of 7 stars. It was a gesture of reclamation, a gesture that told a story of loss and a desperate need to be whole again. The bangle was not just her property. It was a part of her, a phylactery, perhaps, that held a crucial fragment of her power, her memory, or her very soul. And she had been separated from it for 4,000 years. The phantom's hand drifted through the thick, green air, its misty fingers trembling with an emotion that transcended the ages. It was a lover reaching for their beloved, a mother reaching for her lost child, a soul reaching for its own missing heart. The spectral fingers drew closer and closer to the blazing, emerald light of the relic. The air crackled with a tension that was beyond bearing. Malcolm felt that if those misty fingertips made contact with the jewel, the consequences would be catastrophic. The connection would be complete. The partial phantom would become a whole and terrible entity, fully present in their world, with all the powers of an ancient sorceress at her command. The room, the house, perhaps all of London, would be consumed by her resurrected will. Just as the phantom's fingers were a mere inch from the jewel, just as the final, terrible union was about to be consummated, a sound tore through the unnatural silence. It was a scream. It was not a scream of fear. It was a high, thin, agonizing cry of pure, physical pain. Came from within the room. It was Margaret. In that instant, everything shattered. The cry, a sound of pure, mortal agony, acted like a stone thrown into a perfectly still pond, breaking the spell, severing the connection. The consequence was immediate and absolute. The brilliant, emerald green light that blazed from the bangle did not fade. It was extinguished. It vanished in an instant, as if a celestial switch had been thrown. With it, the light from the 7 lamps also died, plunging the entire scene into a sudden, shocking, and total darkness. The abrupt transition from blinding, supernatural light to absolute, pitch-black nothingness was a physical blow. Malcolm cried out, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes from a light that was no longer there. He was left blind, staring into a void, with only the echo of Margaret's terrible scream and the last, horrifying image of the phantom's reaching hand burned into his mind. The oppressive weight in the room vanished. The keening vibration ceased. The heavy, perfumed air was gone, replaced by the normal, cool air of the hallway. The ritual was over. The experiment had failed. Or perhaps it had succeeded all too well. He stood frozen in terror, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the noise that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with questions. What had happened to Margaret? What had become of the phantom? And what of the bangle, now sitting inert and lightless in the suffocating dark? The door was still closed, and he was still on the outside, a helpless guardian who had failed in his one, crucial duty. All he knew for sure was that the night of horrors was far from over. It had only just begun.